Hi, everyone. My name is Preeti. I'm Research Associate in CSEP. I welcome you all to this seminar, which is focused on BP's Energy Outlook, which is the annual exploration of the key trends shaping the future of energy. We are joined here today by Spencer Dale, Gareth Ramsay, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Rahul Tongia, and Shyamasis Day. In the interest of time, I'll try to keep the introductions brief. Spencer Dale is BP's chief economist. He's responsible for advising the board and leadership team on the global energy system and the energy transition. Prior to that, he was executive director for financial stability at the Bank of England and a member of the Financial Policy Committee. He was also chief economist of the Bank of England and a member of the MPC. Spencer joined Bank of England in 1989 and served in numerous roles, including private secretary, head of economic forecasting, and senior advisor at the US Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Gareth Ramsay is a senior energy economist with a career spanning global energy analysis and central banking. Gareth has led the development of BP's flagship energy outlook, helping to shape the company's strategic understanding of the global energy system. And prior to this, Gareth served as an executive director at the Bank of England. Montek Singh Ahluwalia is a distinguished fellow at CSEP, an economist and civil servant, and he has held several high positions, including Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission, Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, and many more. Mr. Ahluwalia has co-authored Redistribution with Growth, an Approach to Policy, which published in 1975. In February 2020, he published his book Backstage, The Story Behind India's High Growth Years. For his outstanding contribution to economic policy and public service, he was conferred the prestigious Padma Vibhushan in 2011, which is India's second highest civilian award for exceptional and distinguished service. Rahul Tongia is a senior fellow with CSEP, where his work focuses on technology and policy, especially for sustainable development. He co-leads the Energy, Natural Resources and Sustainability Group at CSEP and is also active in broader issues of technology. His work focuses on supply options, smart grid.
I think
there is a lot.
Have the bios available online, so
okay,
we could
perfect.
Just maybe one sentence.
Just designation and
designation.
Yes. Thank you. Shyamasis Das is a fellow in Energy, Resources and Sustainability vertical. And thank you for making my life easier. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Ahluwalia to moderate the session.
Well, thank you very much. I have a very simple task, which is to invite Spencer and colleague, if you like, to make the presentation.
Thank you, CSEP, for the invitation to present to you today. I should confess, when you go on a visit to when we published our energy outlook just over a week and a half ago, and so we're visiting different countries. Much of that time you spend in what I call broadcast mode. In a sense, you're telling people what you think, and which is interesting, but after a while you get bored of saying the same thing over again. But every now and again you get a chance to actually stop broadcast mode and start having a conversation mode. So today, for this session, so this is my little treat in 2 days of broadcast to actually have a conversation. So what I plan to do today, I sent some slides, and I apologize to those who are discussing this because I'm not going to do all the slides. I'm only going to do a handful because I really want to raise sort of 3 issues which I thought would just be fun for people to think about in this room. 2 of them, given the background of CSEP and your interest, 2 of them are on public policy issues. And I want one just sort of check how we're just talking about a little bit about how the world is changing in terms of how we think the drivers of oil demand are changing over time. So I'm going to try and be brief in the way of having time to see if I get okay. I'm in control. Having time to have a broader discussion. So with that, let me just kick off. The energy outlook this year, as when I was here a year ago, is framed around 2 scenarios. Those scenarios are defined by the speed of the energy transition. So there are many different dimensions to which will influence the energy system over the next 30 years, and I'll come on to some other ones. But the single biggest uncertainty we face as a company, you face in terms of your energy systems, anybody working in energy, is the speed of the energy transition. And so we frame these 2 scenarios. The green scenario, which we call current trajectory, is designed to capture the pathway the world is currently moving along. And I can talk more about the details of that. But think about this. This is the pathway the world is currently moving along, including current policies, policy pledges for the future, but also a recognition that politicians will pledge one thing and more often deliver something different. The blue below 2 degrees scenario is a sort of what if scenario. And the what if scenario is what would need to happen in the world if we wanted to get on a deep, rapid decarbonisation pathway in which global carbon emissions fall by around 90% by 2050. So this is not in any sense a sense of this is what we think will happen, but a what would need to happen if you wanted to achieve that some sort of deep decarbonisation pathway. Of course, everybody in this room understands this. The likelihood that either of these scenarios will materialize exactly is sort of infinitesimally small. And so the point of this is to explore uncertainties and to think about exploring uncertainties. This is the pathway for these are what these scenarios look like for the global economy. This is what they look like for India. And so in the current trajectory, the pathway that India is currently on, carbon emissions rise on that green line by around 60% by 2050. Now, if I was in Brussels at this point and said, and so the current trajectory for this country, whatever country, is their carbon emissions rise by 60%, there'd be at this point a sharp intake of breath. And so just to understand just the arithmetic of what's going on there, underpinning that green scenario is carbon emission underlying GDP growth for India averaging around 5% a year. When I was presenting to Minister Puri yesterday, he gave me a deep frown when I said it was only an average of 5% a year. So it's 5% a year. Energy efficiency is improving on average a little below 3% a year. So energy demand is growing a little above 2% a year. So you have 2% compounding growth. So that means overall energy demand roughly doubles over this period. That without an improvement in energy intensity, that means carbon emissions would roughly double, but in terms of carbon intensity, but carbon intensity of the energy system, India's energy system, this scenario is improving. Massive build out of wind and solar, reduction in coal, and so there is some improvement in that energy intensity, hence carbon emissions rising by 60%. The blue scenario is sort of, I think, just tells you what this looks like, that sort of deep decarbonisation pathway looks like for India, where carbon emissions are falling by 65%. Relative to anything which is being discussed here in India, I don't think that's particularly an interesting feature. I think what is interesting, perhaps the one interesting thing about that blue scenario is, what does it look like? What do you need to do? And it has two features. One is obviously you build out massive growth of wind and solar and low carbon energy. But the other one is you need a massive improvement in energy efficiency. So in this scenario, energy demand in 2050 is 25% lower than its level today. The economy, the GDP is the same, but you're averaging energy efficiency growth of over 5% a year, which is allowing you to have that growth with improving energy efficiency. Now, the first point, my 3 points, my first sort of public policy point is that 60% growth of carbon emissions on the current trajectory. Now, the current trajectory may be wrong, but the pathway that India is on under sort of almost all circumstances subject to a radical change is carbon emissions in India look set to rise for a sustained period of time for all obvious reasons. You have many people without access to energy, you're going to have very strong growth in your economy, which will then fuel energy demand. There's a limit to how much can be made by low carbon energy. The corresponding scenario for China is carbon emissions falling by 55%. So you have India's rising by 60%, carbon emissions falling by 55%. I'm sure many of you would have seen a week or two ago, China announced that they will reduce their carbon emissions by 2035 by between 7.5% and 10% relative to an undefined peak year. So we don't quite know when a peak year is. It looks about now. And so if I look at my scenarios and say, how likely are they to achieve that? It's very likely. In fact, the biggest criticism you can make of the China target is it's just not stretching in the least. They know they're going to achieve it. The public policy point I wanted to raise, and so I raise it now as a way of just sort of number one, which we can hopefully then debate, is what risks does this pose to India? What risks does it pose where the only major economy in the world, India is the only major economy in the world where their carbon emissions are rising? Everybody else is doing the right thing. Let me just caricature this in a really, in a very, indeed, purposely doing that. But everybody else is doing the right thing. Even China are now reducing their carbon emissions, and they're gonna easily burst through that 7.5%, 10% reduction. They're supplying green technology to the rest of the world, but coal consumption in India rises exponentially, or can just rises relentlessly. And what challenges does that pose? Many banks, Western banks now have a policy: we shall not invest in coal. What danger is it that we shall not invest in coal? We should also not invest in India, because India is being seen in that way. Now, I should say, I wouldn't say any of this in a public forum in such a provocative way. Hence, this is my enjoyment session. But this seems like a perfect group for people to think about that challenge and how to think about it. So number one was just that, and how should we think about, and what should we think about that? The second one is a sort of energy thing. And perhaps particularly interesting for Shyamasis, who I know works within mobility. I just want to talk about oil and how the pattern of oil is changing, and particularly the growth rates for it. So this is just that global story for oil. So these are the same scenarios for oil demand. In a current trajectory, oil demand rises for a little bit out to 2030. It then declines back again. So by 2035, it's pretty much back to the same level. And then that declines in a very slow and shallow way, such that by 2050, it's down to about 85 million barrels a day compared to 100 million barrels a day. So this is a sort of a plateauing of oil demand before a very gradual decline. In that below 2 scenario, if the world wants to get to net zero, you need a faster, quicker, more rapid reduction in oil. But even in that scenario, oil demand is about 85 million barrels a day in 2035. The IEA did a report on natural decline rates in oil. So for those who don't work in oil industries, if you have an existing well, each year that well declines and produces less oil. And so if you want to stand still, you need to invest sums of money. And the IEA estimated that about 90% of the investment in oil over the last 5 years had been used to just maintain the level of oil. So therefore, as a company, do I worry about peak oil? Not really. I have no idea when peak oil will happen, but I know it will literally take hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of investment every year in order just to maintain the level of oil demand. So as somebody who cares about the environment, of course we worry about oil, but as a sort of company that's thinking about our investment strategy, it doesn't pose such a risk. The thing I wanted to, I think is interesting, is how the patterns of growth of oil are changing over time. So this chart here looks at the average annual growth rate of oil demand in different periods. So the chart on the left is history. And then I look at the current trajectory, both in the first half of the period at 2035, and then I look at the second period of 2035 to 50 in the current trajectory, the green line. And then I do that same decomposition for below 2. And it breaks it up into the different sources of demand growth. So how is oil being used? If you focus on that chart, that bar on the left, the single most important driver of oil demand growth over the last 15 years, and indeed over the last 65 years, is oil used in road transportation. So for obvious reasons, so that blue bar is bigger. But if you notice, you scan your eyes across, the blue bar is negative in every scenario, in every period going forward. So I quite like, if I see the same trend in two really vastly different scenarios, it may sort of gives me a sense, well, actually that same trend may actually be in scenarios which lie somewhere in between those. And in all four peer time periods, and both scenarios, oil demand in road transport is declining. And the story here is oil demand for mobility in fast growing emerging economies, particularly here in Asia, will massively increase the demand for mobility. And we think that on its own would raise oil demand by about 12 million barrels a day just over the next 10 years. But that's countered by the fact that, particularly in developed markets, the cars that people are driving become more and more efficient over time. So I can drive more miles with less oil. And also increasingly, those cars are being electrified. So I'm switching away from oil and into electricity. And that pretty much offsets that intrinsic demand for increasing mobility, such that oil demand starts to decline in road use, and it gets bigger over time as we see increasing electrification of the energy system. So what takes over as the biggest source of demand for oil is those red bars, which is oil where it's being used as a feedstock into petrochemicals. So this is when oil isn't being made to move things, it's being used to make things, and in particular, making oil-based goods. And to a very large extent, that's plastics. And so, again, pretty much other than that very final time period, the single biggest driver of oil demand growth going forward is that role of oil going into petrochemicals. So a completely shift. So we often thought about the intrinsic advantage of oil because it's this very dense energy concentrated source of liquid. That's not being used anymore. It's energy, oil being used as a feedstock. And intrinsic, I'm not going to get into boring you with this topic, but I now, rather than thinking, I have somebody at my team who has this big model of car fleets in different parts of the world and how old they are and how quickly they'll move into electric cars and so on. Well, intrinsically, I need to sort of place less weight on that. And now I need to think hard about what's the plastic intensity of global GDP growth. Over time, the plastic intensity of GDP growth has been declining. So as countries get richer, they move away from goods, they consume more services. We're learning how to use plastics in a more sustainable way. And so we're sort of thinking about those issues. If I just look briefly at, this is a story for India, just to locate it in India. Again, I think just focusing on the green line is the more interesting line in terms of the relevant line. Oil demand today in India, around 6 million barrels a day. We have it increasing to around 9 million barrels a day out to 2050. Do I see those same trends for India? Not quite, but a flavour is there. So you can see that road use remains positive, particularly in the current trajectory, those second and third bars, but it gets smaller. So that impetus from road transportation starts to decline because cars do get more efficient. Cars will gradually both, I guess, electrify and also switch to CNG. I also noticed that the role of petrochemicals gets increasingly bigger over time. So that same flavour, the red bars are getting bigger over time. So we can see that same feature there. The out of interest, there's sort of this chart is one of those really annoying charts where there's the biggest bar is the other, and you go, what on earth is in the other? That other in the current trajectory for the next 10 years is a pretty much an evenly split mix between oil used in industry and oil used in buildings. And so that plays a big role in boosting oil demand going forward. So that was just the second thing I wanted to do, was just sort of think about oil and how oil is changing over time, and those drivers of oil changing over time, and the way oil is used no longer as an energy source, but more intrinsically being used as an input for making oil-based products. The third thing I wanted to do, and apologies if I wanted to think about increased geopolitical fragmentation and how that might affect the energy system. So I think when I came here, I guess a year ago, maybe more like 16 months ago, we'd already started to see the sort of an increasing sense of geopolitical fragmentation and sense of the war in Ukraine. Since then, we've obviously had multiple wars in the Middle East. We're seeing increasing news of trade sanctions and trade tariffs. So I wanted to think about how might increased geopolitical fragmentation affect the energy system. And for those who've been to these talks before, we use these scenarios, not the primary purpose is not for public debate and consumption. It's to help our own company. Our company's trying to operate across the globe. It's seeing these increasing geopolitical fragmentation. So how should I think about it? And what was interesting for those who are familiar with this sort of literature, there's a variety of people have talked about this over the last year, but they've come to different conclusions. And I think often they come to different conclusions because they've picked on one particular element and ignored other elements. And we wanted to try and sort of map out a sort of detailed way of thinking about this. So I wanted to think about how might increased geopolitical fragmentation affect the energy system. And by increased geopolitical fragmentation, what I want to do is say, let's suppose that calls countries around the world to want to be more self-reliant and worry more about energy security. So if that is the case, so there may be many other different aspects of energy. It may affect the whole breakdown of the COP process and so on. I haven't thought about that. I just wanted to focus on individual countries becoming more self-reliant, becoming more focused on energy security. How might that affect their behaviors? And so we wanted to think about mapping out carefully the different channels through which this might operate. So one channel through which it might operate is if the world became more self-reliant, it would reduce international trade. And we know from economic theory that international trade is good for economic growth. It allows for greater specialization. It allows for the greater spreading of ideas across the world, increasing productivity. So less global trade will tend to reduce GDP growth, and that reduction in GDP growth will tend to reduce energy demand. So that's one of the channels we want to look through. But that geopolitical fragmentation may also lead to greater concerns about greater energy security concerns. So how might that affect the world? Well, if I'm worried about energy security concerns, if I am importing a large chunk of my energy, suppose I'm India and I'm importing upwards of 85-90% of my oil I consume, 45-50% of the natural gas I consume, I may be worried about that and I may want to reduce those imports of oil. But that same sort of reasoning may also apply if I'm a major importer of low carbon technologies. If I'm importing solar PVs, if I'm importing batteries, if I'm importing critical minerals, I may be thinking, okay, that's leaving me very exposed. So let me try to develop my own domestic supply chains, even if that comes at a greater cost. The third thing I'd always want to do, although I think the answer to more or less every single question in energy is improve energy efficiency. That will always help you because that means you just need less of any types of energy. So that's always got to be a good thing. And I also may place less weight on climate goals. And this is perhaps the one which is sort of less obvious. And I think the arguments for why you may place less weight on climate goals are twofold. One is, if you place more weight on energy security, you've got to place less weight on something else, right? You can't just place more weight on everything. That's not the way that works. And so we often think about an energy trilemma where you're trying to balance energy security, energy affordability, and climate and sustainability. If I'm placing more weight on one of those nodes, energy security, I must have to place less weight on the other two. The other one is trying to pick up that channel from GDP growth. Lower GDP growth means my economy is just less prosperous. I have less wealth. And therefore, my ability to undertake expensive decarbonisation, is particularly in terms of those types of decarbonisations which come at quite a significant cost, low carbon hydrogen, carbon capture use and storage, sustainable aviation fuel, that just may be more expensive now than in the past. And so that may also just mean I just can't afford those climate actions like I could do. So these are the channels that we mapped out. and then what we then do, and it's all written up, it's all online. There's hard copies of the book, not the small ones here, but there's hard copies of the book. But the best way of doing all this is online, because we try to make it interactive online. The charts are interactive. It's far more fun to do it. And in there we explain how we went and tried to calibrate all these different components. And calibrating all these different components is clearly pretty arbitrary, right? You can't, I'm not going to pretend there's any deep science in none, but what we wanted to do is calibrate them in such a way it brought out their qualitative effect to sort of see if we could understand what was going on, even if we couldn't, even if I wasn't going to try and die in a ditch and say that these numbers should be taken literally. So what does this look like? So I won't go through the detail. Well, how does this affect the energy system? This is shown in this chart. So the way to read this chart, that top line shows you that impact of that first channel about how that lower GDP growth from lower international trade, this is for the global GDP, reduces overall primary energy. So on the horizontal axis here is reductions in primary energy relative to a world where we hadn't turned any of these channels on. And so primary energy is lower, and then that's spread across the different fuels. So oil is green, natural gas is red, black is coal, and orange are renewables. And what we're picking up here is the share of these different fuels in the different end use sectors. So the way we think about energy being used in transport, energy being used in buildings and in industry. What's the income sensitivity of those sectors? And then what is the role of these different fuels in each of those sectors? So that's how we ended up getting this split. The heightened energy security is a more complicated beast because many, many different things are going on here. So that first channel says countries which import energy want to reduce those imports. By far and away, the most traded forms of energy are oil and natural gas. So I want to reduce my demand for oil and natural gas. So I reduce my demand for oil and natural gas. The next thing that goes along is this: if I'm not willing to import low carbon technologies from China, the low cost base, I'm going to have to start using my own domestic supply chain. That domestic supply chain is going to be more expensive, and that's going to really reduce my demand for renewables. So that pushes down on renewables. As that pushes down on renewables, if I still got a demand for power, I need to produce that power in some other way, which crowds back in natural gas into that process, because I need to put something back into the process. The winner here for many countries is coal, because coal, for many, particularly if you think about large Asian economies here in India, China, it's domestic, so it's secure. I can use it in the power system when I'm using less renewables. And so I have this sort of mix where I have less oil, less renewables, gas is a sort of a wash, and coal's the winner. And then the third line just picks it all up, just adds the two lines together. Now, we worked on this in the summer and we was really pleased with ourselves. We thought, oh, this is great. This flow chart works really well. I think this is a really detailed modeling. This is a really good way of thinking about it. Did all this careful calibration, did this work. And the thing is, it doesn't really do very much. I mean, the energy demand's a bit weaker. The fuel mix changes a bit. You can't quite see how it's changing here, but it's not changing very much. The overall carbon intensity of the fuel mix gets a bit worse because coal's going up in relative shares, but it doesn't do very much. And we thought, we spent all of this time doing all this work and it doesn't do anything. And then we realized, aha, this may not be the right way of thinking about this. It doesn't do anything at a global level, because at a global level, how one country behaves offsets how another country is behaving. So at a global level, it's tending to balance off each other. But we need to start looking at an individual level to explore more what's going on. And so in the outlook, we sort of compare and contrast how India behaves relative to how America behaves. So if you think about India, how does India want to behave in this world? Well, definitely want to import less oil and gas because it's pretty much has the same import dependency as India. I don't have any desire to reduce my renewables because I'm the low cost producer of renewables. So I just heavily invest in renewables. I also do a bit more coal. And so that's that story. I compare that with the US. Well, the US is a massive exporter of oil and natural gas. So it just doubles down on oil and natural gas. But it says, well, I don't want to expose myself to importing critical minerals, PV panels, EVs from America. So I reduce my demand for renewables. So you have China sort of emerging as a new electro-state on one side, and America sort of doubling down as an oil and gas user and producer on the other side. So sort of the story here is increasing geopolitical fragmentation leading to increasing energy differentiation. At a global level, it all washes out, but increasingly the sort of intrinsic differences you see in economies are amplified as they go from one to the other. And so just the final chart I wanted to show is, what does this look like for India in terms of the story here? So one is that first line is lower trade leads to lower GDP, lower energy demand. That big proportionate size of coal there, I think to a very large extent, just reflects the disproportionate size of coal in the fuel mix in India. I think it may be a little bit to do with the importance of coal in terms of income elastic or sensitive sectors, but it's largely just the share of coal. In terms of heightened energy security, what's going on here is, well, one is I want to import less oil and gas, so that reduces my oil and gas, but I also want to import less low carbon technologies. I don't want to be importing batteries. I don't want to be importing solar PV panels. So that's raising the cost of renewables. So that's also reducing renewable growth. And the big winner here, you can see, is coal, because coal does the story that you want it to do in terms of it's domestic, it's so insecure. It can offset, it can be used in the power sector in an efficient way if I'm using less renewables. And so this is my sort of third thing, as sort of for many of you here thinking about public policy, we're seeing increased geopolitical fragmentation. What does it do? When my company asked me what to do, I think my message is sort of twofold. One is, at a global level, it's not likely to change energy markets that much, because many of the, at least as calibrated here, one country, what China's doing in one side, India, America is offsetting on the other side, and so those offset each other. But as a company that tries to operate in many countries around the world, what we need to realize is the needs of these different countries are going to become increasingly differentiated as people follow that way. Or perhaps one final way of thinking about it, if everybody's pursuing a common goal of deglobalization, they will have very similar sort of elements to that. You want to reduce your fossil fuels, you want to build out electrification, you want to build out wind and solar. Most countries will follow that. If you're worrying more about energy security, self-interest, then increasingly you're not going to have common pathways. What one country's self-interest is very different to another country's self-interest. And so in many respects, we spent our summer proving the obvious, which was that point, but that's how we sort of went about thinking about doing it. I'm going to stop there. They were my 3 points I wanted to.
Thanks very much. Well, before we make it a conversation, can I just ask a couple of questions, which I think would be relevant for the audience? First, from what I see here, what you describe as India is essentially a 5% growth rate. So anyone who thinks that India is going to aim for a higher growth rate is going to be much tougher, whatever happens. I mean, more CO2, and if you want to reduce it that much time. Is that correct? The whole thing is 5%. Second, when you're looking at the impact of the lower trajectory for emissions, is it being assumed that the model has somehow chosen a kind of least cost combination of what's possible?
Yeah, so think about it as a sort of goal-seeking thing, which is now I should do how to think about it. How we do it in practice is not as quite as sophisticated. I'm going to explain it to you, but in principle, what we do is say, suppose you want to have a target of 90%. Let's find the least cost way of achieving that 90% reduction. So it's a sort of backward goal-seeking trajectory designed to sort of achieve the least cost or the most feasible, most plausible pathway.
Okay, good. But that's just sort of everybody catches those points. So now a conversation. You're the most conversational guy I know. This is your chance to flag things that they can respond to.
Thank you, Spencer and Gareth. I think looking at this with two lenses, one India and one global, but we'll focus a little more on India to some extent. I will just preface my brief remarks with some learnings from last year's conversation that, as mentioned, scenarios are not predictions. And you purposely do not get into what will the price be, because that's a very important thing. And I know certainly predicting an oil price for an oil company is always a dangerous task, but it would be kind of interesting to at least think through, because you use energy efficiency as one of the hooks along with, or levers along with geopolitical fragmentation. But learning curves in technology and innovation would seem to be another very important thing when we're projecting out to 15, 25 years from now. So to what extent are we assuming continued evolution in learning curves, or are there disconnects? Maybe land, for example. It's not just critical minerals, but for a country like India, land could be just one possible choke point. Now, you have between the current trajectory scenarios and the 2 degrees, a certain amount of change listed out for India. And at the risk of oversimplifying, there are 3 things that could be happening. One is, of course, efficiency. So that helps. If you're targeting a 2-degree world, you will use less by investing in efficiency. The second, now here there's a bit of a clarification. When you say 20% less energy, for example, as a hypothetical, is that end-use energy or primary energy? Because as you electrify, your primary energy comes down dramatically. So how much of these numbers is just arithmetic as opposed to a more structural, fundamental shift? And then the third, in your 2-degree world, and I'm not sure how much you can comment on this, is there a hit to GDP? And how much? Being
What?
Is there a hit to GDP?
Oh.
Or development by whatever measures, not just GDP? So this is the first set of comments. The second question, if I look at a little bit of detail here, and coal is the elephant in the room for India. Between your current levels of 22 exajoules for coal, the current trajectory is taking you to 34, and your below 2 degrees is looking only at 8.8. So it's a dramatically different future for coal. Oil and gas, not as much. Now, what you don't get into, and obviously you're not trying to give a policy prescription, but if I were to do planning saying, well, both of these are bounds and the truth will lie somewhere in between, what isn't talked about is, when do you expect a peak and what sort of shape of that curve is practical? Because there's a lot of scenarios that people have put out that say, well, on one hand, we know that the near future is going to look like the present, and it'll take us to somewhere. But yet, working backwards, we've got either 2070 or some other hard stop or constraint. And therefore, the only way to get from midpoint down is with this cliff in reduction. And what are any thoughts around those practicalities, or even from a planning perspective? And last, I have many smaller points, but I won't go into them. Your claim that someone is going to say that India is not doing the right thing, quote unquote, either that person is purposely naive, or India is doing a very poor job of explaining its development story. Because when you do very simple math, even with a 55% reduction for China and a 60% increase for China through 2050, the per capita emissions for China are higher than they are for India. Forget the cumulative or the area under the curve. So I think that would be my obvious message or response to that. Thank you.
Okay, sure, yeah, I will just
Do you want to do this or do you want to?
open out to others. or-
Well, if you want to have both of them make.
Yeah, why don't we have both?
comments, it
Yeah,
might
both,
be-
yeah, yes.
we
That'd
can
be,
read
yeah,
it.
that'd be good. Why don't we have both?
As you prefer.
Yeah, just do that and that way.
Okay.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for presenting the outlook. I think it covers different elements of the energy sector, which gives a fair bit of idea of how the future looks like, both at a global and specific to India level. I have just a few, kind of observations and few clarificatory questions, and I had the opportunity to go through some of the slides in advance. The first thing which stood out to me while going through your presentation was the 1.5 degree target is totally out of question. It's out of consideration. Now we are looking at 2 degree, which also looks very distant actually. If you compare the current trajectory and the 2 degree, even while perusing your slides, I was not looking at the 2 degree because the departure is so much actually, right? I was looking at the current trajectory. So that was actually the first reaction I had. Just interested to know, considering the current trajectory emissions, where we are going to in terms of temperature. So have you kind of estimated or at least got a sense of where we are going to land actually post 2050 kind of? Because that will be, I think,
That has to be with respect to the world.
global.
Yes,
Global.
soil, yeah.
This is global actually. We also see that India's emissions trajectory seems to turn the corner around 2045, which is encouraging. Considering the government's official target of achieving net zero by 2070, have you got a sense whether the country is in line to achieve that ambition? I think we as Indians would be interested to know that. Also, as per your projection, India's coal demand is not expected to peak by 2050. Again, whether you have got a sense when we can, even post 2050, when we can expect a peak to reach as far as coal demand is concerned, because India's emissions are, coal is responsible for a significant share of India's emissions. That's why. Few broad suggestions as far as the outlook is concerned. When we are talking about energy transition, we cannot ignore minerals and critical minerals of interest, because these are actually required to realize this energy transition. I think we would be interested to know BP's take on the future demand and supply of these metals and minerals of interest, because these are becoming the new oil of the global economy. Countries are using them as their, I would say, foreign policy tools. Also, we are seeing some embargoes happening, some tit for tat kind of trade policies. So I think that would be an interesting addition to your outlook. Then no discussion today is possible without referring to AI. And we see that your power demand from these giga size data centers are already exceeding the total consumption of some of the prominent economies. I mean, recently I was going through an IMF data. It was of 2023, which shows that data centers globally already consumes more electricity than France. So have you got any separate insight on AI? Because more data centers are coming. I mean, it's not like we have reached the saturation actually. More big giga size data centers are in the pipeline. So I think that would be also a good insight for us. You also have rightly pointed out the importance of energy efficiency. I think we all recognize that energy efficiency is the first fuel of a country's energy basket. We always say that. You also showed how much oil demand, how much coal demand, how much power demand a country can reduce. But it would be good to show which are the end uses or sectors where you can achieve these gains, because that would help the country or the policymakers to set targeted interventions, because just oil demand or just coal demand or natural gas demand may mask the possible opportunities. The other observation is, as the study looks at demand, primary fuel demand, it would be good to also see the supply side dynamics, because in today's geopolitical climate, where we see punitive tariffs, coming on India, we don't know whether that is the end of the road. So how that will play out in the supply chain actually. So these are some of the broad observations. I have some specific comments also. We can come back later on that.
Okay, thank you. Well, all yours.
So I've got mics on, Spencer. You've also got mics on.
Oh, okay.
So I will try and rush through quickly, and then I'll take a couple. I think Spencer will take a couple. I get first dibs, so I get to choose the ones I want. And then we'll try and leave enough time. Just say on the first couple of questions. So yes, we do assume continued big efficiency gains on renewable side, particularly solar. Actually, solar carries on growing faster than wind. So solar's sort of 10% of Indian primary energy by 2050, and that's in our current trajectory pathway. Wind gets up to about half of that. So yes, we do assume continued fast pace. We try and take into account land use constraints and also others like grid challenges, investment required. We think it's feasible. Your other question, 2-degree world. No, we don't differentiate in GDP space. In both scenarios, there is a hit to GDP from rising temperatures. I think our logic is there are things that go both ways in terms of mitigation spending, but also that many of those GDP effects would probably take place a little bit after 2050 of the largest. Now, you can argue with this, of course, but we don't differentiate between the two in terms of GDP.
Not damages GDP, but just the fact that if I'm in an energy constrained world, am I doing more than what can deliver the services? Do I actually reduce my development to stay within a 2-degree world? Is the question any poorer country would ask.
Indeed. And in our, I think, relatively stylized assumptions, we're assuming that there are offsetting effects here. For example, there is a large amount of extra activity that comes from the higher mitigation spending you need in a faster decarbonisation world, which is in itself, to some degree, a boost to activity. Recognise there are constraints from that. But the stylized assumption in our fast decarbonisation scenario is that this is still feasible within a world where you're not having to ration economic prosperity and welfare, basically. The last one I'll take, then I'll pass over to Spencer, so there's enough time to open this up a bit. It's just on data centers. I can't resist picking up that one. So we didn't include anything in the slides. We did actually quite a bit of thinking on AI in the report, and there's a special kind of box on that. So we've attempted to calibrate how big we think data centers are, both globally and by country. They're big, but it's by no means everything. You'll know here that there are many other growing sources of power demand, and it's not just data centers. The one message I'd give you, and I definitely recommend you read the 2 pages on this purely because I wrote them, is that we must think more broadly than just data centers when we think about AI and energy. I personally think too much attention is being focused just on the power demands of AI and not enough on what AI is going to do for energy demand more widely in terms of prosperity, but also for energy supply. I suspect if it turns out to be at all useful, one of the places it will be most useful is in our various energy industries, both fossil fuel and low carbon. And I think it may well have much broader systemic impacts for our energy system that we need to think about that go way beyond how much power data centers will demand. Spencer, I'll hand it to you.
So just pick up 2. One is in terms of critical minerals, yes, we do worry about that. I think in terms of where we think this is most likely to bite most quickly is in copper. In the early 2030s, we think we're going to see an increasing shortage of copper. And then we try to then, I'm not sure this is the right framework to do it, but try to think about how will that play out. Some of that will play out by other uses of copper, being able to substitute other materials rather than it falling within the energy system. But within the energy system, it's going to hit emerging economies whose pockets are less deep than developed economies. And so copper is the issue there. Let me, the other thing is respond to Rahul's point about that the underlying thing of what India's doing is fine, so therefore we're okay. I'll finish on that one because it may sort of provoke others. 100% agree. But what I did observe, I observe some European countries saying, I'm not going to do support any foreign aid investment into fossil fuel infrastructure. That was stupid. That's bonkers. But many central governments around the world did it. I had many banks who indiscriminately said, I'm not going to invest in coal infrastructure. If anybody understood the arithmetic of India, they would know that was a stupid and silly thing to do. They did it. And so I think just saying, look, I've looked at the numbers, they're fine, isn't sufficient here. I think it's necessary, but I worry that it's not sufficient. I think my instinct is this is coming. And I think if I was advising the Indian government, which I'm not, but if I were, I would say I would get on the front foot now in setting out this narrative and explaining to people what you're doing and why you're doing it. And if it was me personally, and I'll say this again in this room, is I think it's inevitable that India is going to carry on using coal for as far into the future that I can see. I think what I would be doing is saying, help me use that coal in a sustainable way. Here is some clear demonstration projects for CCS. I can't afford to fund that. Multilateral development banks, here's the bill. You help me use my coal in a sustainable way. If you don't help me use my coal in a sustainable way, when I start getting those emails, I'm just going to forward them on to you. Because the reason why I'm not using my coal in a sustainable way is not me, it's the fact that you, the rest of the world, are not willing to internalize this externality associated with me using that coal. So I agree with you 100% about the underlying righteousness of what India's doing. My fear is the nature of this debate, where I have on one side people who want to point to anybody not doing the right thing so they don't have to do the right thing, and other people on the other side, unless you're stopping everything, also wagging their tail, means that may not be as sufficient in the middle.
Well, I think, I mean, let's see if the audience wants to pitch in at that point. How many questions, Brad? Yeah, Lavish.
I don't know if this is a question or a comment. The fact that you don't look into prices to me seems very I'm very uncomfortable with it, especially because I mean there are situations where with greater energy efficiency you may very well get higher energy demand. So there is this whole issue of you have to get the prices right if you have to get reduced energy usage.
So on prices, clearly we have prices in this system. I have demand balancing supply. So I can't have a model that closes without that. If I told you the oil price, I guarantee you nothing would be said about anything about this energy outlook forevermore, other than BP says the oil price will be like this. And the legitimacy of that oil price will be almost meaningless because the nature of these scenarios. Remember, these scenarios aren't things we believe in. So in a hypothetical world, which we don't believe in, this is what I think the oil price will look like. It will just be silly. Now, I can use carbon prices in my model to do a massive wedge between that producer price and the consumer price. So I can do all of the things that you want to do, I can do and do in my model. In a perfect world where everybody was rational as this group and they would all know that the relevance of that oil price was sort of zero, we could do it. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. And I just, from harsh experience, I know that if I said that one thing, nothing else would be said about this energy outlook. Other than that, so I agree with you. We do have prices. The prices underpinning them, I think, look pretty plausible. But we can't. If I then publish them, everything else would just go, and it's just the problems of communicating uncertain, complex, noisy information in this world means it's too hard to do.
No, but I don't think we can leave it at that. I mean, it would be reasonable to ask, given the difference between for India, the current trajectory and the less than 2 degrees trajectory, what's the carbon price that somehow or the other we have to get in order to make that transition?
No, have a good debut.
$20?
So, whereas I do know the oil price in this scenario, but you'd have to talk to me to tell you. I genuinely think that talking about a carbon price is kind of we can't, because we do use a carbon price. I have a carbon price in here, but I think a carbon price in a scenario like this has to capture so much more than simply something that's labeled as a carbon price. I've got mandates in there, I've got bans in there, I've got, you know, ICE bans. I put that in my carbon price measure. I could tell you what the carbon price is in here, but I don't think it's a thing you'll ever see being called a carbon price. If it's very high and below 2, clearly, but I think a carbon price anywhere will ever be that high? No. I think this kind of decarbonisation will come through a whole range of measures, which I have literally plugged them into model and I've called them a carbon
Well,
price.
what you're implying is that there are a whole range of measures that you think governments would be willing to take
I think they would have to
because
take.
they like
I'm
to
not.
take measures,
Yes.
but they're not prepared to contemplate a carbon price,
Yes.
which would make those measures happen.
Yes.
Yes.
Then in that, okay, we
Well-
accept that. What is the carbon price we're talking?
But when Europe says thou shalt not buy an internal combustion engine car after 2035, which is a law, which is what they said, that I can frame that as a carbon price, but they're not framing it as a carbon price. They're framing it as thou shalt not buy an internal combustion engine car after 2035. And me calculating what the implied carbon price would be for that, I'm not sure, other than perhaps a few people in this room, it's a particularly useful thing. What we observe governments doing, and I think quite legitimacy, they want, if you want, differentiated carbon prices across a whole range of different sectors. Because if I had one single carbon price, that would then, the impact that would have, the amount I would need to do that to get out coal in steel would be huge, and the impact that would have across all other parts of the economy would be tremendous. So what I think we observe governments quite often mandating, imposing restrictions, imposing regulations, which always have a shadow carbon price. But whether it's actually worth computing the dollar a carbon ton for that, I'm less convinced.
So just getting.
But we should probably not get this.
But, I
out.
have the problem comes in. I mean, just saying that you need to get energy efficiency and not getting prices right is just the wrong messaging that goes to the government. You
Yes.
have to get the prices right, otherwise it doesn't work. I mean, the whole thing falls.
So I guess perhaps this may be the way to think about this. What am I doing this for? I'm doing this for my company that operates in an energy system. I'm not doing it as a form of public policy advice. So what I'm saying is, how might the energy system look in Montek's least cost way of achieving these different outcomes? I'm not advising governments around the world what levers are the most efficient levers you should pull to achieve that pathway. I'm just saying this is the space I may well be operating in. So it may well be, in some sense, the reason why you're reacting in a different way to your public policy house, and why we're reacting in our way is because I'm using this to help set a corporate strategy. May be the difference. So if I was doing public policy, clearly this is not enough because it's not about helping me advise on public policy in that way. So in that sense, I don't see there's that much difference between us. And I think we're just using it in different ways.
Yep.
Yes, I have a couple of points. One of them is what are your views on the nuclear energy? Some of the big tech companies are using nuclear energy for their data centers, for example, Microsoft, etc. So will that be an energy efficient? And my second point is regarding biofuels. We are seeing that there's increasing trend of biofuel like ethanol.
You made your
etc.
point.
As well. Okay.
What about
I do
nuclear?
nuclear and you do bio. Yeah. So just on nuclear. So I fear our outlook as we present it disappoints fans of nuclear. In the sense that it never looks that big. Nuclear is doing a lot of work in these scenarios. Unlike the last few years where its share of power generation has been falling, it pretty much holds steady. Now, in a world where power demand is almost doubling, that means nuclear generation is almost doubling. That's a lot of spending and a lot of new generation capacity coming online. Most of it in China. They're just moving more quickly than everyone else. I think India is actually second in terms of new generation capacity that comes on. So nuclear just about keeps pace with demand for electricity overall globally. It doesn't look that impressive because wind and solar are growing so crazily, but it's playing an important role here.
And biofuels follows a little bit like those blue bars, because at the moment in most parts of the world, biofuels are mandated as a blend. India is its exception. Most other blends rates aren't going up. So as road fuel usage, oil usage goes down, biofuel usage in road goes down. But what happens in the outlook is that those biofuels are diverted into sustainable aviation fuel. So the biofuels shift away from road transport, increasingly into aviation and a bit into marine.
You mentioned during the scenarios a kind of contrast that was emerging between China and some others who are pushing the low carbon industry, energy, and the United States, which seems to be doubling down on oil and gas. As an oil company, do you think they can carry this on in geological and economic terms for much longer? One. Second, is it the right thing? There seems to be a challenge that is being mounted in the EPA's latest endangerment finding, which has temporarily been withdrawn, but it's still very much on the cards and includes a former colleague of yours, Mr. Steve Koonin. What is your take on this?
Do you want to do this?
No, I don't.
Can America carry on doing this? From a geological perspective, yes. Right, they won't run out of oil. There's no shortage of oil. There's no shortage of natural gas. Can they do it from an economic perspective? I think they can in the short term, but the danger is all the huge technological advances we are seeing are often wrapped up within a sort of electrification type world. And so where does that leave the US economy? Others here will have their own views. I'm not sure that's where, if I was giving advice to you, economic advice to the US, that's where I'd do. In terms of the EPA endangerment finding, it relates back to this earlier point about carbon prices. A lot of the action that happens in America are via these various types of mandate rules in terms of the Clean Air Act, in terms of the CAFE standards, which has also been significantly reduced. So in this year's outlook, relative to last year's outlook, we are seeing less progress made in America in terms of carbon emissions because, and now it's 5 years in a 25-year scenario, so we have to assume something beyond then. But it's clear the actions they are taken will have some impact. And the endangerment finding, if it stays in terms of power sector, the reduction or the sort of the removal of penalties for the CAFE standards in terms of vehicle efficiency. So yes, it's real, and we've tried to build those impacts in.
Stop saying they're doing the right thing or not.
Yes, and we go to America in a couple of weeks' time, so we will see how delicately transfer that.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the session. My question is about geothermal energy. India has recently launched national policy on geothermal energy, which uses a lot of infrastructure and capacity from the oil and gas industry. So we have solar and renewables on one hand, we have oil and gas on one hand. This seems like a mid pathway where, with the changing geopolitical fragmentation, drill, baby, drill, everything else, geothermal seems like a good option where many countries are seeing a lot of energy production. What are your outlooks for India specifically and in general in a global sense for geothermal, and perhaps add it up with geological hydrogen as well?
Okay.
So just on this, brief. I mean, I think geothermal is really interesting and may well in future outlooks. Who knows, when Spencer's gone in the future and we go around this track again, may well start to play a bigger role. We try and avoid at the moment really pushing hard on unproven and very new technology. So at the moment, geothermal doesn't play. I mean, it's happening and it's there under the bonnet, but it doesn't play a big role. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we don't think there is, the possibility that maybe this will turn out to be a more fundamental technology than that. It's not playing a big role in these. And actually, similarly with white hydrogen as well, with geological hydrogen rather. We could get into another conversation about hydrogen more generally, but I suspect we haven't got time for that. But that is the answer. Yet. Maybe in a couple of years' time.
It's too early about it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Two points / questions, one from a public policy perspective and the other on company strategy perspective. On the public policy side, you mentioned that India has a messaging problem. Now, shouldn't that also apply to the 52 or 54 countries of Africa, except that they are small and each of them has a sizable growth? So in that sense, do you foresee this becoming a challenge for a big subpart of developing countries and not just India? And how would you advise not just India, but those countries as well? And the second one, on the company strategy side, where do you see not just the GIOs, the global majors, but also NOCs heading? Because we are seeing, and where I sit doing research on national oil companies, the narrative is again talking about economic fragmentation in many countries or NOCs, especially in Asia, sat out the last 10 years of upstream, essentially keeping calm and importing rather than going out and investing or internationalizing. So do you see that changing aggressively from a company strategies perspective? Thanks.
I agree with you on Africa. I mean, two caveats. One is some of those are very rich in natural gas. Some of them are very rich in wind and solar. And so I don't think all of them will be resorted so heavily to coal. And I think coal is a sort of totemic type view. Unfortunately, India, I fear India is a victim of its own success. It becomes the world's fourth largest economy. It's set to become the world's third largest economy. It's the fastest growing major economy. And so I'm afraid that has many benefits, but it has some drawbacks in terms of how it's in terms of people's sort of sightlines. Do countries increasingly place greater emphasis on exploiting domestic resources? Yes, that's a clear, significant part of that fragmentation story. What would you do? I've got to substitute. If I don't want to import energy, I have to generate my own energy. Some of that for many countries will be wind and solar. But in other countries, and I think you see it here, there's an increased premium and emphasis placed by the government on trying to maximize its production of its own domestic oil and natural gas. The really great sort of case study, if you want to see this, is in China, where about 5 years ago, the NDRC passed a policy which was to stop the secular decline in oil production and start increasing it. And by golly, guess what? They're starting to increase. Natural gas demand, imports in China of LNG have come off really quite significantly. Part of that is pipes in from China, but part of it is increasing domestic gas production. And so I think it's happening. These things aren't just sort of theoretical things. We can see countries behaving this way.
Last question then.
So, sir, in the model that you showed, so my question is with regards that in order to increase efficiency, say if India starts producing more oil and gas of their own, say domestic production and all. So do you foresee that in the next 5 to 10 years, like India, like recently the news came about the Andamans, there's like gas reserves and oil reserves. So those kind of discoveries being made, and that would in order improve the efficiency and also the.
So I think, and there'll be others here, including from BP, who know this better than I think the thing I have in my head, the way to hold this, is both oil and gas production in India are on a sort of secular decline. And the key thing which one can try and do is reduce or arrest the pace of that decline. For natural gas, in the current trajectory, we assume that natural gas production stays around the current level. That's sort of would be quite an achievement to do. I think sort of some of the biggest oil fields here have been declining. We are operating work with ONGC to try to slow that rate of decline and even get some sort of sort of increase. But I think that's the way to hold it. Rajiv, unless that's not the right way of.
No, that's the right way.
That's the right.
Talking about Andaman is too early to talk about. In fact, we are working with ONGC and helping them doing a stratigraphic way to understand the reservoir better. But having said that, I think the government of India is also interested in increasing oil and gas production. And the BP's partnership with ONGC is a good example of that. What we are doing is we will be helping ONGC, and what we have indicated is that we will help in increasing their production of gas, oil by about 40 to 45% and gas by 90%. So we do see a potential. In KG-D6 basin, we commissioned 3 projects. We are producing almost 1/3 of India's gas with land. And we have participated in a number of annual OLP blocks, and we do see a potential of new discovery there. But as Spencer rightly says, that this field, most of this field go under decline. So any new discoveries will help in sustaining the production.
Thank you.
Well, it only remains for me to thank you. I mean, too much material for any one person to absorb. So I'm going to go and look at the model which you say one can muck around with. Is that indicated how one gets to it? I mean,
I mean, we do in the Outlook online, we sort of say these are the sort of calibrations we did. This is the premium we added to sort of give countries an emphasis to move away from essentially from imported oil and gas into domestic energy. This is how much we increased the cost of renewables and so on. So we all of those sort of add factors are all documented.
okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for